also addressed a little bit in your new book, Genesis, AI, Hope, and the Human Spirit, which hopefully everybody will read, with Henry Kissinger actually as a co-author. So are we going to win the AI race? And what are the scenarios where we win and lose?
It looks like we will. And let me define it. So I think that the San Francisco consensus, which is, I call it, is what people in San Francisco believe, which charitably was is that you're going to see a build from current agentic computing to various forms of recursive self-improvement to eventual AGI and superintelligence. In order to do that, it requires an enormous amount of hardware. Google TPUs, NVIDIA chips, and so on. Everybody in the audience knows that. It sure looks like the hardware restrictions that the Trump and Biden administrations have put on China are going to prevent them from competing at that space. I've been recently in Shanghai for a few days. I have good relationships with the Chinese, and my conclusion is they're fighting a different game. They're going to adopt AI in every product, every service, everything, but in a more classical way, whereas America is going to seek for AGI. I was quite worried that we would end up in a superintelligence race where you would end up with such enormous gains that one side would have to actually attack the other one. In other words, a preemptory attack. It looks like that fear from me was not well grounded in facts. I think we're going to be okay for a few years.
In the race for AGI, but then also in parallel robotics, China is going to be miles ahead in electricity production.
It's a huge issue. So again, let's use China versus the US as a metaphor. What are China's strengths? And I'm not praising China, I'm just trying to report it. They have solved their electric power problem. They also have full control over social media, so they don't have the kind of problems that people here complain about. They have enormously talented software people, and they don't have enough hardware. I think that's roughly where they are. They're also incredible capitalists. They call it Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics. But trust me, it's pure raw capitalism. Let's call it what it is. In the U.S., we have the many benefits everybody understands. We do not have enough electricity, and at least in our consumer stuff, the Chinese are likely to beat us. Our hardware architectures are fantastic, and I'm including the Amazon chip, obviously the embedded chips, TPU v5, which I'm happy to say I was part of TPU version 1. All of that stuff is incredible. So if you think about it, and I testified in Congress a month or two ago on this, we looked at the amount of electricity required in the United States to power the expected demand of data centers, and we needed, in our calculation, by 2030, 92 gigawatts to be built. And for reference, a big nuclear power plant is somewhere between 1 and 1.5 gigawatts. To give you a sense of how many nuclear power plants are getting started in America, effectively zero. So we had hoped, and I've hoped in my lobbying and testifying, that the government would fast track availability of all kinds of electricity. And indeed, they have promoted oil and gas, but they've also hobbled solar and wind to a terrible degree, which is an error. The country needs more energy. And if we don't get more energy, we're not going to be able to fully exploit the lead we have in AI and AGI. It's very clear. And by the way, the obvious next question is, what do we do? Well, there are scenarios. For example, the president went to Saudi and the UAE and did huge deals for multiple gigawatts. And so we might find ourselves in a situation where our training for our most important thing, the thing which are the essence of America, which is American intelligence, is actually being developed in kingdoms. And that may be the only fallback we have.
What about robotics? We seem to be pretty far behind in that front.
Yeah, if it's okay for me to be completely blunt, the Chinese are doing the same thing in robotics that they have done in electronic vehicles. In case you're confused, while the current government in the U.S. gets rid of solar and wind subsidies and promos, China put in 172 gigawatts of solar last year, I think is the number. It's remarkable. So the Chinese race around solar and EVs, electronic vehicles of one kind or another, looks like they've won. They're using all of those technologies, in particular, new ways of building stepper motors and other very inexpensive, very powerful, physical thing. Good example is Unitree just launched the R1 for $6,000, available in December. I've ordered one. We'll see how good it is. But the arrival of humanoid robots is likely to be dominated by China. I'm not suggesting there won't be areas where the U.S. will play. The U.S. will still have spaces of very high-end, very sophisticated stuff. Our software is so much better than the Chinese software. But at the hardware level, I think you should assume that the world will be awash in inexpensive Chinese robots. In the same sense that there'll be awash in inexpensive Chinese electric vehicles. Who knew?
You've been saying recently that, one of the things that's inevitable is some kind of an AI disaster, and we're hoping that it's like 100 people that die and not 1,000 or 10,000 or 1 million or even 100 million. But suppose that it does play out, that there's a catastrophe that's a wake-up call. What do you want to do with that wake-up call? What's the next move for Eric Schmidt after the wake-up call?
Well, so the background here is that Dr. Kissinger, Henry, and I spent an awful lot of time talking about the period in the 1950s where he was a key component of all of these things. And so what he did was he used the fact that we had used the nuclear bomb to negotiate over about a 15-year period a set of treaties that restricted nuclear proliferation. Those treaties, when they were negotiated, have allowed us to be alive today. So these were centrally important. Without controlling the spread of enriched uranium and the other secrets, we would all be toast, literally, because of crazy people and so forth. Is there an analogous set of things that we can do? The problem here is, or I guess the good news is, we're not in a war. We haven't had a nuclear bomb. We don't have that thing to discuss. So we can talk about it, but governments tend to act reactively. So let me tell you, there are 3 obvious threats right now, which I think are fairly well understood. The first is misinformation. And the software that we're all collectively giving people allows for all sorts of misinformation, fake videos, fake news, what have you. We all understand this. It's all open source. That's done. That's a threat to democracies, and maybe to dictatorships, but certainly to democracies. The second one is cyber. And I think one way to understand cyber is that if you can write code, you can also write cyber attacks. It's the same logic. And you have these incredible gains in software. It's frightening how good these remember, my career is as a programmer. These things program better than I ever did. It's like shocking, right? And then the third one is bio. And I think most people believe that one of those 3 will create some kind of mini crisis that will then cause the governments to say, hang on, let's have a conversation about how to really deal with the downsides. The upsides are incredible. Right. And I want America to win, and I want us to run as fast as we can. And we're indeed doing that with the Trump administration, which is great. Right. But we have to be aware that these things are possible. The one I'm particularly worried about is biological. And it goes something like this. You take some existing pathogen, and using biological techniques, which I won't discuss, you can modify it enough that it cannot be detected, but it's still quite dangerous. That's an example of a threat. There are many others.
How do you deal with proliferation? The Biden approach was, okay, let's contain AGI to these 5 companies, Google being one of them. And then let's say any model with over 1E26 training flops has to register with the federal government, and then we'll keep it all contained. So that all got scrapped immediately, after the election, and got replaced by the new David Sachs document, which the David Sachs document is much more about how do we move as quickly as possible and win the race. But it doesn't really address proliferation. And obviously in America, we want startups and researchers to have incredible access to technology and compute. On the other hand, the 3 people in a basement making a biological weapon is a real scary thing. So how do you balance those?
It turns out if you read the David Sachs President Trump announcement, they're very clear that they want to continue to study the security aspects of AI, especially in a geopolitical way. And that's code for China versus the US. And so they continue in their proposal to fund things involving nation state attacks and so forth and so on. And I fully support that kind of stuff. There's probably a difference on the misinformation social media stuff between the two. But for example, the Biden rule was simply that you had to report if you're doing a training run 10 to the 26 or greater. I was part of the group that made that number up. We made it up because we had no better number. I'm not suggesting it's the right number. And the conclusion you come to is it's probably the case that we know, our government, I don't know this, but I'm guessing, knows where the training runs are going on in China because of espionage. And it's probably the case that the Chinese have espionage on the US knowing where our training runs are. So I'm not sure the nature of the training runs is a secret. And frankly, everybody knows where the data centers are because they're immense. So we will see. Another attack on the 1026 is that the training is getting more cost efficient. If you look at they moved from something called FP16 to FP8. That means 8 precision floating point. People are now moving to 4-bit floating point, which is bizarre. It turns out these training algorithms seem to be quite tolerant for floating point in precision, which is a shock to me. So again, we're getting more efficient in training. This creates more of a proliferation problem. If I can say in general the proliferation issue, I'm not worried about big companies in big countries because I can count them. There'll be 10 huge data centers, 10 huge training runs around the world. I'm much more worried about the open source groups, which can operate in the shadows. They don't have to solve every problem. They just have to do one thing well. They can patch together the open source, which is generally available, and it's good enough. If you look at the quality of DeepSeek R1 and now R2 coming, sure looks like it's in 80 or 90% of these top closed models. The closed models people, which obviously includes Google, get very defensive over this because they say, look, those are kind of synthetic. They have diffused the models. They've trained our best information. They're not, all of that is true. They're correct, but they're nevertheless useful for specific things, and they could be used in a proliferation issue to do various forms of cyber and biological attacks.
Using distillation and as a starting point, what founder advice would you give? We're seeing numbers like they're completely unprecedented at ages of founders that are also unprecedented. I mean, you saw Sergey and Larry when they were very, very young, but now they're even younger. We're talking 18, 19 years old now. So what advice would you give them?
So I think the most important thing to say is that the barrier to entry to starting a company is effectively zero now. So let's think about it. What do you need to have a company? You can register it online. You need some money to get started. You have to pay yourself. You don't really need any programmers. You need a couple people to pay Google or Claude or what have you to write the code for you. So you're pretty good there. You can use third-party logistics companies if you're building a hardware device, and you can use essentially contract manufacturers to build whatever hardware device. So it looks to me like for hardware and software, the barrier to entry is almost zero. That sounds great until you realize that as a result, you're now competing against everyone all the time. So as an example, in my career, which has spanned more than, 55 years now doing this stuff, the key thing that's true is the compression of time. The other thing I would say to founders is it's really important that everything you do be learned and not specified. I'm doing a couple of startups on my own. We'll see how well they do. But with them, I say, I know nothing, learn everything. So you can learn how to support your customers. You can learn what the customer wants. You can learn how to, and learning meaning in the AI sense of learning it as part of either supervised or unsupervised training. And if you take a learning approach, then you build a system that if it works, it will explode. Because once the learning accelerates, you get into a quasi-monopoly position. So the philosophy of winning goes something like this. Run as fast as you can, get there as quickly as you can, build it around learning, and if it takes off, you'll be a hero, because once it learns how to become stronger. And eventually, 2 or 3 years, you'll start to have various forms of reinforcement learning, which are self-replicating. And so then you're likely to get accelerations further. That's the most likely path for the next trillion-dollar company, past the equivalents of Anthropic, OpenAI, et cetera.